Most people spend a large part of their mental energy trying to get others to see them correctly, to see their intentions, their effort, their reasons. When someone misreads them, they feel unsettled. When someone dismisses them, they feel smaller. They go over conversations in their head, rehearsing what they should have said. They send extra messages to clarify. They over-explain. And through all of this, they are not chasing connection. They are chasing approval for who they already are. That quiet, constant need to be understood is not a strength. It is one of the most overlooked sources of emotional suffering in modern life. If this kind of thinking helps you see yourself and the world more clearly, hit the like button and subscribe. We go deep on Stoic philosophy here, not just the quotes, but the real practice of building a stronger, calmer, freer mind. Number 1. The trap of needing validation for your inner world. There is something people rarely talk about: the exhausting habit of needing others to understand your inner world before you can feel okay. Not just loved or respected, but understood. People want their intentions recognized, their efforts seen, their reasoning validated. And when that does not happen, when someone misreads their actions or judges them without full context, there's a real ache that follows. That ache is not small. It sits in the background of many conversations, many relationships, and many quiet moments when a person replays what was said and wonders why the other person just does not get it. The Stoics noticed this pattern long before modern psychology named it. Epictetus was a man who had every reason to feel misunderstood. He was born into slavery. His circumstances were not of his choosing, and the world around him had very little interest in understanding who he truly was. And yet he built one of the most precise and powerful philosophies of personal freedom ever recorded. The foundation of that philosophy was simple. Some things are in your control, and most things are not. Other people's understanding of you falls firmly in the second category. What others think, perceive, and conclude about you is not yours to control. The moment you accept this fully, something loosens. The grip of constant explanation and clarification begins to weaken. The need to be understood often disguises itself as a legitimate emotional need. People tell themselves they just want fairness. They want accurate perception. They want to be seen clearly, not misrepresented. These feel like reasonable desires. But underneath them is usually something more fragile, a sense that their identity and worth depend on external confirmation. When someone misunderstands them, it does not feel like a simple error in communication. It feels like a threat to who they are. That is where the weakness lives, not in the desire for connection, but in the belief that another person's accurate understanding of you is necessary for you to stand steady inside yourself. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively in his private journals, the Meditations, about how the opinions of others are not real obstacles to a good life. He was emperor of Rome. He was surrounded by people who praised him, criticized him, misread him, and used him. He could have spent enormous energy managing those perceptions. Instead, he returned again and again to the question, what is actually in my power right now? He did not write for an audience. He wrote to remind himself daily that his inner state was his own business, and that anchoring it to the shifting opinions of others was a form of self-abandonment. The journals were not published in his lifetime. He was not seeking to be understood. He was seeking to be clear within himself. When you build your emotional stability on the foundation of being understood, you hand control of that stability to everyone around you. Every person who misjudges you becomes a threat. Every conversation where you are not fully seen becomes a small crisis. Over time, this creates a pattern where you're constantly scanning for signs of how you're being perceived and constantly adjusting, explaining, or defending. You become reactive. Your inner state is no longer generated from within. It is imported from outside, from the expressions on other people's faces and the tone of their messages. Stoicism calls this living according to externals, and it is considered one of the primary sources of unnecessary human suffering. The Stoic correction is not to stop caring about relationships or communication. It is to stop making your inner peace dependent on the outcome of other people's understanding. You can explain yourself once, clearly and calmly, and then release the need for a particular response. You can want to be understood while remaining undisturbed if you are not. This is not indifference. It is a far more stable form of self-respect. It says, "My value does not increase when you understand me correctly, and it does not decrease when you do not." That position, held consistently, is what the Stoics called virtue, a kind of inner order that no external circumstance can fully disrupt. Number 2, how over-explaining reveals inner insecurity. Over-explaining is one of the most common behaviors of people who feel chronically misunderstood. They add extra details. They send follow-up messages. They revisit completed conversations to offer more context. They preemptively justify decisions before anyone has questioned them. From the outside, this can look like conscientiousness or thoroughness. But underneath it, over-explaining is almost always driven by anxiety, a quiet but persistent fear that without enough context, the other person will draw the wrong conclusion and think less of them. That fear is the real engine. The extra words are just the exhaust. The Stoic philosopher Seneca wrote in his letters that a person who is constantly preoccupied with how they appear to others has not yet found their own center. He used the metaphor of a man at sea, sailing toward wherever the wind happens to blow. Not navigating, just reacting. Over-explaining is that kind of sailing. Each additional explanation is a reaction to an imagined or real judgment. The person is not expressing themselves. They're defending themselves against a threat that is largely constructed inside their own mind. Seneca's advice was consistent. Find your own standard first. Build your own judgment of your actions. Then let the opinions of others be what they are, passing weather. One of the subtle costs of chronic over-explaining is that it actually undermines the communication it is trying to improve. When someone explains themselves too much, the other person often registers not clarity, but anxiety. They sense that something uncomfortable is happening, that the speaker needs something from them in return for all these words. That need can create distance rather than closeness. It can make a simple interaction feel weighted and complicated. The person who over-explains is often trying to draw the other person closer, but the mechanism of the behavior pushes them further away. This is not a moral failing. It is a practical consequence of building communication on a foundation of emotional need rather than grounded expression. There is a useful distinction in Stoic thought between things that are preferred and things that are required for a good life. You can prefer to be understood. That preference is human and entirely reasonable. But when understanding becomes a requirement, when your day cannot go well unless this person finally sees what you meant, you have crossed from preference into dependency. That dependency is what creates the behavior of over-explaining. Because if something is required, you will keep working to secure it. You will add more words, more context, more attempts. The work never fully stops because the other person's mind is never fully in your control, so the requirement can never be permanently satisfied. Cato the Younger, one of the Stoics held in highest regard by Marcus Aurelius and others, was famous for a quality that made many people uncomfortable. He simply did not explain himself very much. He acted according to his judgment, stated his position when necessary, and did not return to it repeatedly to secure approval. This was not arrogance. People who knew him understood that he was deeply principled, but he had no interest in managing the perceptions of those who were determined to misread him. His self-possession was total enough that he did not require their understanding to act. This is what genuine inner freedom looks like in practice. Not the absence of communication, but the absence of need inside the communication. To reduce the habit of over-explaining, the Stoics would suggest a simple but demanding practice. Before you add more words, pause and ask what you actually need from them. If the answer is clarity, if more information genuinely serves the exchange, then continue. But if the answer is reassurance, or validation, or fear of being judged, then the extra words are not communication. They are a transaction. You are offering information in exchange for comfort. Once you can see that clearly, you can begin to ask a different question. Can I give myself that comfort directly? Can I review my own actions, find them reasonable, and release the need for the other person to confirm that? With practice, the answer becomes yes. and the over-explaining gradually stops. Number 3. The Stoic view on identity and the opinion of others. The Stoics had a very specific view of identity that is almost entirely opposite to how most people in modern life construct their sense of self. Most people build their identity outward, from what others say about them, what role they play in a social group, how they're described by family, what reputation they carry. They gather these external descriptions and assemble them into a self-image. The problem with this method is obvious once you see it. If the materials for your identity come from outside, then every time the outside shifts, someone changes their opinion, a relationship ends, a reputation is damaged, the identity built from those materials begins to shake. Epictetus taught that the only true self is found in your faculty of choice, what the Stoics called the prohairesis. This is your capacity to judge, to decide, to reason, and to respond. It is not your job title, your relationships, your physical appearance, or the story others tell about you. It is the active, choosing part of you that exists before any of those things. When your identity is rooted in this, the opinions of others become far less threatening. If someone misunderstands you, they have formed a wrong picture of some external circumstance or behavior. They have not touched the part of you that actually chooses and judges. That part remains exactly as it was. Most people feel a strong emotional response when they are mischaracterized, particularly by people whose opinion matters to them. This is natural, but the intensity of that response is a useful diagnostic. The stronger the distress when you are misunderstood, the more your sense of self is rooted in external perception rather than internal clarity. A person with a deeply stable, internally grounded identity can hear a false description of themselves and feel something like, that is simply not accurate. Not, that might be who I am. Not, I need to fix this. Just a calm recognition of the gap between the perception and the reality, followed by a return to their ordinary functioning. That calm is not distance or coldness. It is groundedness. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations that people harm themselves far more than others harm them. The harm does not come from what others say or think. It comes from how a person responds to that internally. If someone misunderstands you and you spend 3 days disturbed, rehearsing the conversation and questioning your own worth, the person who created the original misunderstanding has long since moved on. The suffering being experienced is entirely self-generated and self-maintained. Aurelius did not write this with cruelty. He wrote it as a practical observation about where suffering actually comes from and what that means for where it can be addressed. You cannot control the other person's understanding. You can control what you do with your own mind afterward. There is a modern version of this problem that has intensified significantly: the social media phenomenon of constant public identity performance. People post, explain, clarify, and defend. They read comments, respond to criticisms, and adjust their presentation based on what gets approved and what gets rejected. The entire system is designed to hook into the need to be understood and validated. From a Stoic perspective, this is one of the most efficient machines ever built for undermining psychological stability. Not because connection is bad, but because the feedback loop created between posting and receiving reactions trains the mind to make external validation the measure of inner worth. The Stoics could not have predicted this specific technology, but they described the underlying mechanism with perfect accuracy 2,000 years ago. Rebuilding identity from the inside out is a slow process, but it starts with a single shift in where you look for confirmation. Instead of asking, "Does this person understand me correctly?" you begin to ask, "Do I understand my own actions correctly?" You develop the habit of self-examination that Socrates, whom the Stoics deeply admired, called the foundation of a meaningful life. You review your choices with honesty. You correct what is genuinely wrong, and you stand behind what is genuinely right, whether or not anyone else recognizes it. This does not require isolation or indifference. It requires simply that the verdict you reach about yourself is yours, not assembled from what others reflect back at you. Number 4, the social cost of needing to be understood. The need to be understood does not only damage private inner peace, it has real, measurable effects on relationships and social functioning. People who carry a strong need to be understood tend to enter conversations with a hidden agenda, not a manipulative one, but a needy one. They are not only exchanging information or spending time with another person. They are also, beneath the surface, seeking confirmation. They want the other person to recognize them, to validate their perspective, to signal that they see who they really are. When conversations carry this additional weight, they become less free. Both people can feel it, even if neither one names it. Seneca wrote about friendship with unusual clarity. He said that the purpose of a true friendship is not to acquire an audience for your inner life, but to share the work of living well. A friend who is constantly needing your understanding, your validation, your reassurance. That friend is making a demand on you, even if gently. Over time, that demand is tiring. It is not that the person is a burden as a human being. It is that the structure of the relationship has become unequal. One person is perpetually in need of something the other cannot permanently provide, because no amount of understanding, however sincere, satisfies a need that originates inside the person asking for it. The irony is that people who most need to be understood often achieve the opposite of what they are seeking. Because the need is felt by others as a kind of pressure, it tends to create slight withdrawal rather than closeness. People around someone who consistently over-explains or repeatedly seeks reassurance begin to feel a low-grade tension in the relationship. They like the person, but they also feel that no matter how clearly they communicate understanding, it is never quite enough. The well does not fill, and so gradually, over months or years, people give a little less of themselves to that relationship, not out of cruelty, but out of the natural human response to a dynamic that feels subtly demanding. Marcus Aurelius noted that one of the most important things a person can do in their relationships is to expect less from others, not out of pessimism, but out of a realistic understanding of human nature and human limitation. People are busy with their own inner worlds. They have their own concerns, their own interpretations, their own blind spots. Expecting them to understand you fully and consistently is not just impractical. It is a kind of unfairness toward them. It asks them to perform a task that is genuinely very difficult, and then holds them accountable when they fall short. Letting go of that expectation is actually a generous act. It frees others from an invisible obligation they never agreed to carry. There is also the question of what happens to your behavior when you are primarily motivated by the desire to be understood. People in this state tend to adjust what they say and how they say it based on what they believe the other person wants to hear. Not in a lying way, but in a softening, qualifying, image-managing way. They leave out parts of their truth that they fear will be misread. They emphasize parts that they think will land better. This is subtle enough that most people do not consciously notice themselves doing it. But the result is that the communication produced is not fully honest. And a relationship built on communication that has been edited for approval is built on a slightly distorted version of who you are. The Stoic alternative in relationships is to communicate honestly and cleanly, without the need to manage the other person's resulting impression. You say what is true. You say it clearly. You receive the response without deciding in advance that a particular response is required for the conversation to have gone well. This does not mean you do not care about the relationship or the other person's feelings. It means you are bringing yourself into the conversation fully, rather than bringing a version of yourself that has been pre-shaped to earn understanding. Paradoxically, this kind of clean, unguarded communication is what actually creates the deepest understanding between people. Not because you engineered it, but because you stopped trying to. Number 5. Building freedom through inner self-sufficiency. The ultimate destination the Stoics pointed toward was a state they called autarkia, self-sufficiency. Not in the material sense, but in the psychological sense. A person who has developed genuine inner self-sufficiency is not cold or isolated. They love, they engage, they contribute to their community, but they do not require external inputs to maintain their basic psychological stability. They do not need to be praised to feel worthy. They do not need to be approved of to act. and they do not need to be understood to feel secure in who they are. This last point is where the freedom is sharpest, because misunderstanding is so common, so unavoidable, and so completely outside any person's control. Building this kind of self-sufficiency is not a one-time decision. It is a practice, a daily return to the question of where you are sourcing your stability from. Epictetus gave his students very practical exercises for this. One was to examine, before any significant interaction, what you're hoping to get from it. Not in a calculating way, but in an honest one. Are you going into this conversation to contribute something, to exchange something, to accomplish something? Or are you going in to receive something, a particular kind of recognition, a confirmation of your value, a correction of a misperception? The first group of motivations leads to engagement. The second leads to dependence. There is a distinction worth drawing carefully here between self-sufficiency and emotional suppression. Some people, when they hear the Stoic message about not needing to be understood, take it as a license to disconnect, to bury their feelings, to pretend not to care, to build a wall and call it philosophy. That is not what the Stoics taught, and it is not what works. Suppressed emotional needs do not disappear. They accumulate and express themselves in distorted ways. Passive aggression, emotional numbness, sudden disproportionate reactions. True Stoic self-sufficiency is built not by denying emotional needs, but by meeting them internally wherever possible, and by questioning whether the ones you're trying to meet externally are actually necessary or simply habitual. Marcus Aurelius returned again and again in his private journals to the theme of drawing from his own resources. He lived an extraordinarily demanding public life. Every day brought criticism, flattery, manipulation, and misrepresentation. He could have been consumed by the effort to manage those perceptions. Instead, he chose to draw inward, not to retreat from his responsibilities, but to return repeatedly to the only source of clarity and stability he actually controlled: his own reason, his own values, his own judgment about what was right. That returning is the practice. It is not a single act of resolve. It is a discipline, performed day after day, that gradually shifts the center of gravity of your psychological life from outside to inside. One practical way to begin this shift is to develop the habit of honest self-assessment that the Stoics called the daily review. Each evening, Seneca described examining the day's actions, not to condemn yourself, but to understand yourself. What did I do today that I would do again? What did I change? Where did I act from a solid place? And where did I act from fear or need? This practice, done consistently, builds a relationship with yourself that gradually becomes stronger than your relationship with external validation. You begin to know yourself well enough to trust your own verdict on your actions. And once you trust your own verdict, the verdict of others becomes less urgent, not worthless, but no longer necessary for your basic functioning. The freedom that comes from releasing the need to be understood is not dramatic. It does not arrive all at once, but it accumulates quietly in small moments. The moment you explain yourself once and then let it go. The moment someone misreads your action and you feel the discomfort without being destabilized by it. The moment you do the right thing in a situation where no one will ever know the full story, and you do it anyway, because your own understanding of your action is enough. These moments, practiced and repeated, build something the Stoics consider the highest human achievement. A life that is genuinely your own, not assembled from the reflections of others, but constructed from the inside, held together by your own clarity, and answerable, finally, only to your own reason. There is a version of you that does not need the room to agree. That does not need the other person to finally come around. That does not need the misunderstanding corrected before it can move forward. That version of you is not cold, not distant, not indifferent to people. It is simply grounded. It has a center that holds regardless of what is reflected back from the outside. The Stoics did not consider this an advanced achievement reserved for philosophers. They considered it the basic work of any person who wants to live well, the daily, unglamorous practice of returning to yourself instead of reaching outward for confirmation that you are okay. What this video has laid out is not a call to stop communicating or to pretend other people do not matter. Relationships matter. Being honest and clear with others matters. But there is a difference between communicating because you have something real to offer and communicating because you need something in return. One comes from a full place. The other comes from an empty one. And the emptiness cannot be filled from the outside. Not permanently, not reliably, not by any amount of understanding that others provide. The Stoics were consistent on this point across every school, every teacher, every generation. What you need in order to be okay must be something you can supply yourself, from your own reason and your own honest self-examination. If this script gave you something real to think about, share it with someone who needs it. Subscribe for more content that goes beneath the surface of Stoic philosophy and into the practical work of building a calmer, clearer, freer mind. The next video continues this conversation.